So for today's November presentation, we are very grateful to our lovely speaker, Lisa Schneidau, who is going to be talking to us today. Welcome to you, Lisa. Lisa was born in Buckinghamshire and originally trained as an ecologist. She's worked in nature conservation sector for a number of years across the UK as an advisor, as a surveyor in various roles. She now lives down here in the southwest of the UK, where, as well as still being very much interested and involved with nature, Lisa is both an author, and I'm sure she will tell you about her books in due course, and a storyteller on a variety of different themes. And the theme which Lisa is going to be speaking to today, in whichever manner she chooses to see fit, and we will find that out in just a moment, is folklore, folk tales, history, ecology to do with the river and similar environs. So to find out more, I shall leave you in the very capable hands of our speaker for this month, Lisa Schneidau. Lisa, welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark. And thank you for inviting me along. Yeah, what a topic, rivers. So I'm talking to you from Chagford, which is a little town in the northeast of Dartmoor. And our local river is the River Tean or Tin, depending on how you want to pronounce it. Starts up on the moor in a bog somewhere and ends at Teignmouth. And it is one of a number of different rivers that come off of Dartmoor, a number of what seem to be a huge number of rivers in Devon. But in my working life, which has been largely so far in nature conservation work, I have always ended up working on something to do with rivers. And that is largely because in our landscape, rivers are literally lifeblood. They are features which really shape the landscape, give life to the landscape. And of course, they are only one part of that wondrous water cycle that you might have learned about at school. You remember that one where you have a river flowing and then the water evaporates and then the clouds rain it back down again and water runs everywhere. All those amazing little statistics and stories about one drop of water and where that can end up. And the fact that in my cup of tea here, there might be a drop of water that William Shakespeare drank a few centuries ago, and so on and so on. There's all of those things to talk about. But from an environmental point of view, rivers are a crucial part of our ecology. From an historical point of view, they are a crucial part of everyone's lives since year dot. If you imagine a time when there was no piped water, when there was no kind of water company or water service, and the only places you could probably get your water from were the river or the well. It kind of changes our relationship to rivers, really, thinking about them in that way. And now water is provided for many of us across the world in increasingly efficient, industrialized, cleansed ways. It's quite easy not to think about rivers, or only think about them if we might have a moment to walk alongside them or drive or walk over bridges that cross them. But rivers really, ever since humans have been around, they have been essential to human life. Now, in terms of folktale and story, I wanted to say a little before I tell you a few stories about where I've come from with story. Because as a storyteller, I work with the oral storytelling tradition where I will seek out traditional folk tales and I will retell them. I will retell my own versions of them. And as a living tradition, storytelling really helps us to connect with that heritage by telling the stories to other people. And then if they hear stories they like, then they will tell to other people, and so on and so on. And as that story is passed through the population, is passed down through generations, that story changes a little bit like Chinese whispers. It will take on a little of the character of the storyteller. It will take on the spirit of the time and what's going on around. It will take on all kinds of nuance. as it travels through the years. There have been some studies done of ancient story, and one story, Jack and the Beanstalk, you might have heard of. Linguists think that that story is at least 5,000 years old. And if you imagine how many times that story was passed from person to person to person before it reached your ears, and how many people you might have told it to, either from a book or actually telling the story, you'll get some idea of how the heritage of story works. And if you're a folklore nerd, and I know I am one, and I think, Mark, you're certainly a folklore nerd. That's a compliment. I think there's quite a few folklore nerds on the call, probably. You will know that there are different kinds of traditional stories. There are the creation myths, the stories of how the world began. There are the great mythological cycles that come from different parts of the world, the Norse myths, or all those different things. Even in Britain, our own Arthurian cycle of stories, or the Mabinogion and the stories that are contained within that from Wales. Those are stories that are very much set within a cultural and a geographical framework. Then you've got fairy tales, which are those rollicking great stories with kings and princesses and dragons and monsters and rounds of three and evil stepmothers and happily ever afters. The kind of big tales that are archetypal, and they bring all kinds of magic and everyday life, and again put them into this curious world of alchemical symbol. But then you get the folk tales, and the folk tales are a bit smaller. They can still contain quite a lot of magic, but they are generally the stories that bubble up from place and from land. And as an environmentalist, you would expect me to be interested in those. I'm particularly interested in what those stories might tell us about the land and the environment of a particular time, or in the old days, if there are no timing set to those tales, what they tell us about our life today and what wisdom they might contain for how we could choose to live our lives within this landscape at this crucial time that we're living in. And we are, of course, in a climate and ecological emergency in the situation we find ourselves in. What have those folktales got to advise us? I would challenge any storyteller that there isn't any single one of us who expects there to be some little nugget of wisdom somewhere in the folklore and the folktale that could really help unlock something. So I guess with my work with folktales, I'm unashamedly following an agenda here. I'm looking for stories of land and environment. And it's quite interesting, when I first started looking for stories of land and environment in Britain, I would find storytellers telling amazing tales. You'd often find them on a nature reserve, and they would be there as a kind of creche for the kids while the adults went off and explored the nature reserve. And the storytellers on those sites, they would be telling stories of Anansi or Coyote, stories from Africa and America, really powerful stories, but they weren't stories of that place. They weren't stories of the nature around. They were global tales. And I wanted more of a connection with the native flora and fauna. And when I first started looking for stories, I thought, well, there's bound to be loads. There's bound to be a whole raft of stories of badgers and foxes and water voles and orchids and any species I might choose to look for, it would be there. Of course, that was absolute rubbish, because folk tales and fairy tales and traditional stories are first and foremost about people. Of course they are. We're humans. We record our experience. We retell it if it's funny or amusing or informative. But every single one of those stories, bar only a very few, also tell about the environment. Because, of course, we are animals living in our environment. If a Grimm's fairy tale will tell you the little girl with a red cape walked into the forest. I'm there hopping up and down the sidelines going, well, what was the forest like? Like, what were the species like? And what was the weather like? And were there any flowers around? Was it springtime? What was the bird song? And once you begin to think of story in that context, there are so many questions and there are so many things to investigate. So for me, story has all of that magic embedded within it. And I've now written 3 different books on folktales to do with environment. The one that links to this talk is, I'm just going to shamelessly hold this one up. This is River Folktales of Britain and Ireland. This came out with the History Press in June. And it followed on from Botanical Folktales and Woodland Folktales. You can see what I'm doing there. The first of the books, Botanical Folktales, was really a collection of stories that followed the cycle of the year and followed the cycle of the plant year from winter solstice to winter solstice. And I produced those stories after investigating them, telling them, changing them, adapting them, and then writing them down. And I wanted to produce a collection of folktales that could be used in the field. They could be used by wildlife trusts or forest school or education charities, anybody working with nature who needed story material, historical stories, folktales, that they could use and tell to help connection to the environment. Again, that's my unashamed agenda coming through. So I've continued on a similar line, really, with the woodland tales and now with rivers. What do these stories tell us about rivers? And how can they give us a little bit of information or a little bit of inspiration about where we find ourselves? In a folktale, a river can be a number of things. A river can be a god. It can be a very powerful deity, and it can be a force of nature that kills. There is no doubt about it. Father Thames, he has at times been stinking and sewage ridden. He has at times been frozen solid so that the whole city of London came out onto the ice. He has at times claimed lives, lots of lives. The same with the goddess Sabrina, or the Seven, as she is now known. And you will find rivers all over the country being given those forms, those characteristics, if you like, those spirits of place. Rivers can also be a very, very dangerous place. If you think about the life in rivers, it is above water on the fringes of a river as part of the river system and the floodplain and the banks, and all of those insects darting across the top, and all of those creatures that might choose to partly live in the water and partly out. But when you go under the surface, it's a whole new world. There are creatures there that are dependent on being in water and being in clean water, or being in a river that has fresh gravels at the bottom where they can spawn, or that has habitat that they can burrow into, or banks they can shelter by, trees they can shelter under. So that magical world underneath the river's surface, to the ancients, it must have seemed magical indeed. If a salmon was there for a few months, but then suddenly disappeared and then appeared again, that must also have been quite a magical thing. So the first story I have for you is a story about a salmon. It's a story that starts in the sea, and it starts in the seas around Ireland. And it is a very old story indeed, because the story begins with a flood, perhaps the flood. And if you think about a flood that you might see from land, you might watch the water creeping up, you might watch the sea swallowing the land, you might be horrified at the changes it would bring. But imagine if you were a fish underneath the surface. Imagine how a flood would change your environment. Suddenly your world would expand, and there would be a loss of landmarks, watermarks, river marks. I can't quite find the language, but it would be easy to be lost. And the salmon at the beginning of this story was lost. It couldn't get back to the mouth of the river where it was born. And it was time to go back. The salmon knew it was time to go back. And yet wherever it swam, everything was unfamiliar. And the salmon had many adventures underwater in that new, bigger sea before it finally found the right place. It finally found the place where there was eelgrass, where there was estuary mud, where it somehow smelt right. It had found the mouth of the River Boyne. And as that salmon flashed silver as it swam over that mud and back into the fresh water, always swimming against the current, the colours of the fish began to change. Silver and tawny and red, as that salmon forever swam against the current upstream, sheltering along by the banksides in the reed beds and sheltering underneath the trees as it went, and swimming over great beds of open mouths of pearl mussels as it went. And as it carried on upstream and upstream and upstream, finally, eventually, it reached the very top of the River Boyne. And at the top of the River Boyne, there was a deep, dark pool of water. And now the salmon could rest. The salmon could consider spawning, possibly. But around that great dark pool of water at the top of the River Boyne, there were 9 hazel trees. And each one of those hazel trees had 9 hazelnuts. I know it's Friday afternoon, but how many does 9 times 9 make, children? It's a lot of hazelnuts. But the salmon just happened to be waiting around at the top by the surface when one of those hazelnuts fell from the hazel tree, and it fell straight into the mouth of the salmon. And the salmon swallowed it. Now that felt weird. The salmon suddenly realized that it knew more than it had done before. It was more aware of everything going on. It was more curious. And so it waited until another hazelnut came, and then another, and then another. That salmon ate all 81 of those hazelnuts. And by the time it had finished, not only was it very fat, but it also knew everything there was to know in the whole world. Everything. It's like swallowing the internet, having it instantly available to you. Well, that was quite a thing. And when the salmon realized it knew everything there was to know in the whole world, it decided not to bother with the spawning. The salmon swam down and down and down into the deep, and it swam out of sight, and it swam out of memory, almost. Because among the humans living up there on the ground, the humans had a story that somewhere at the top of the River Boyne, there was a great salmon, the salmon of knowledge. And if you caught that salmon, and if you ate a bit of the flesh of that salmon, then you would take on all the knowledge there was in the whole world. You would know everything. Well, it's only a story, right? But one man decided he was going to find out if that story was true. His name was Finnegas. He was a druid, and he decided he was going to go and live in the forest. He was going to go and live by the river. He was going to find out if he could get all the knowledge there was in the whole world. And so he set up camp. And so he managed to live the first cycle of seasons, easy in the late summer, difficult in the winter, hungry in the spring. All the time he was fishing, and he was learning everything there was to know about that river. All of the creatures that came and went, the seasons, the cycles, what ate what else, and above all, the salmon, the habits of the salmon. I often wonder whether it was those observations from Finnegas that started off our knowledge of the watery world of rivers. And he fished out many salmon in his time. Most of them ended up with a hole in their lip and perhaps a little wiser when they got put back, but he never caught that salmon. 7 long years he was waiting by that river. He was living in the woods. 7 long years he was looking for that fish, but he never found it. And one day something changed. You see, there was a king nearby, and that king, well, his queen had just had their first child, a fine boy. And the king had called his wise men, and he'd said, "So, what do the stars say? What does the astrology say? What is the future of this fine boy?" And the wise men stroked their beards. Well, this was awkward. "He is going to be a fine warrior, my lord," they said. "He is going to be the best of warriors. He would beat you, hands down. But there is more. He will be the death of you," they said. "He will cause your death." "Well, I'm not having that," said the king. "I've got plenty of life in me yet, thank you very much. I think my son should be sent away to a place where we know he's safe, but where he cannot cause trouble." And he called for advice again, and they advised him to send the boy to Finnegas, the druid in the woods, the one that knew a great deal about hedgecraft and about survival, but nicely out of the way. Now, the lad's name was Finn, and Finn went to stay with Finnegas. And Finnegas was a good teacher. He taught Finn much of what was known in those days about ancient magic, about songs and story, about nature, about fighting, about hunting. But Finnegas never told Finn why he was really living there in the woods. He never told him about the salmon. That was his little secret. All that Finn knew was that every day after lessons, the old man would go down to the river and he would fish. He was obsessed. It looked so boring, thought Finn. Finnegas never gave the game away. A little while later, there was one particular day. The lessons were really boring. Finn was losing attention. Finnegas was just, couldn't quite keep it together. And just after lunchtime, Finnegas said, "Come on, lad, we've had enough for today. Come on, I'm going to teach you how to fish." All right. And so the two of them went down to the bank. The two of them cast their line into the river. And wouldn't you know it, it wasn't long after at all that Finn's line went under. And Finn was desperately heaving and pulling at the line. But there was something really, really big on that hook. Well, it took the both of them to drag that line into the bank. And there, twitching in the mud, breathing its last, was the biggest, fattest, spottiest salmon Finnegas had ever seen. This must be it. This was the salmon of knowledge. Finnegas couldn't help but do a little dance in the mud, and Finn just thought, strange old man, strange old man. But he didn't say what it was. That was his secret. Finnegas got his knife. He cut up the salmon. He put parts of it in a pan. He set the pan over the fire. The fire was lit, and he said, "Finn, watch that pan. Do not let the fish burn, and on no account eat any of it. Have you got that?" "All right." "Have you got that?" "Right." Strange old man. So Finnegas went back to camp. I'd like to think he went to get a bottle of mead to celebrate. And meanwhile, Finn watched the pan and the salmon over the fire, and he was a good lad. He did what he was told. He watched over it. He shook the pan occasionally, and as the fat got hotter, it began to splutter. And the salmon's flesh turned from deep, deep pink to an opaque, paler pink. And the skin of the salmon began to blister and pucker. And as he watched, as he shook the pan, a great glob of fat flew out of that pan and straight onto Finn's thumb. And Finn did what any of us would do if a great blob of hot fat flew out of the pan. Straight into his mouth. And then Finn knew what he'd done, because with that tiny little glob of fat went all the knowledge in the whole world, and it transferred itself from the great fish to Finn. He knew everything. He knew why he was there. He knew the past. He knew the future. He knew why Finnegas had been living in the woods. And then when Finnegas came back, he could see immediately what had happened. This was awkward. Imagine 7 years of your life questing for something that suddenly this idiot of a... Well, he wasn't an idiot anymore. How would you feel? Well, they say Finnegas did 2 things. First of all, he vowed he would never eat salmon again. I think he'd probably had enough by then. But the second thing he did was to kneel in front of the lad Finn. And he said, "You know a great deal more than I do. Will you be my teacher? Will you teach me what you know?" And in that way, Finnegas the Druid demonstrated that he didn't have knowledge, but he did have wisdom. And as for Finn McCool, well, Finn McCool became one of the greatest warriors Ireland had ever known. The leader of a great warband, the Fianna, who would roam across Ireland. Well, the adventures of the Fianna, that's definitely another story for another time. But Finn McCool, all through his life, whenever he needed to know something, all he had to do was to bite his thumb. So that's a little example for you of a river tale. And it's quite fun to play with that story from the perspective of all of the different characters, including the non-human ones. So I want to turn to talking about river monsters now, because so many of the river tales of Britain and of Ireland are about curious otherworldly creatures that live in rivers. I would love to hear if any of you have actually ever seen the Loch Ness Monster, but that is just one example of local folklore, really, maybe even modern folklore. But it's very difficult to find a county in England or a county in Wales or in Scotland or in Ireland that doesn't have its own stories of river monsters. Some of them, to be honest, they remind me of those advertisements we used to have in Britain in the 1970s, those public information announcements, those terrible films where you just saw a bunch of kids going out and playing on farm machinery and you were just waiting to see which one died first. You know those ones? So there are all kinds of hags and ghouls and monsters who are waiting there under the water, waiting with their hand outstretched, waiting to pull you in, pull you under. So Jenny Greenteeth is a good example. Jenny Greenteeth is a character who is that malevolent creature. She happens quite a lot in the north of England. Peg O'Neill is another version of Jenny Greenteeth. But it's quite interesting thinking about this related to our existing rivers now. I'll say this very plainly, our rivers are in trouble. Our rivers at the moment are awash with sewage. They are full of pollution from intensive farming. They are dug out and deepened and widened. The water rushes through them much faster than it did for all the drainage coming off the land. And to me, Jenny Greenteeth is covered in sewage sludge. She is utterly disgusting. She's almost choking on the quality of a lot of the rivers that we have now. There's not that many other stories really about polluted rivers, but there are many stories about the archetype of hidden monster or terror in rivers and in waterways, and in fresh waters as well, in wells and in bogs. So one example of a river monster is what the old Anglo-Saxon language might have called a worm. Many of the dragons in our folk tales in Britain and Ireland are worms and dragons of one kind or another. There is a wonderful story from Sussex, from Lyminster in Sussex, about a dragon called the Knucker dragon. And the Knucker dragon lived in a knucker hole, which is, I think it's a glacial feature. It's a very, very deep pond. In the folklore, they go on for miles. But the Knucker dragon was merrily eating its way through the population of this small town. And they sent out for heroes, and of course no heroes turned up. The dragon was just too scary. Until eventually one, Jim Puttock, turned up. And he wasn't big, and he wasn't tall, and he wasn't strong. And the mayor looked at him with slight disappointment and said, well, what do you need, armour, sword? And Jim Puttock just said, no, I'll need as much flour and sugar and butter and as many eggs as you can spare. Okay. So Jim Puttock set up a big cauldron over a fire, and he tipped all of these ingredients in, and he went to see the wise woman. And she gave him all manner of herbs, malevolent herbs, things like mistletoe, wolfsbane, perhaps the odd strange little pointy mushroom or two, maybe even an agaric. And he tipped all of those in as well, and gave it a good stir with a small tree trunk, and asked the locals to help look over this thing, until eventually the fire cooled down and they turned the pot upside down, and there on a big cart was the biggest, wobbliest pudding you've ever seen. Well, Jim managed to get somebody to give their horse to pull the cart through the town until they got to the bridge near where the Knucker dragon lay, lolling across the road with its head almost too big to lift and its tail nowhere in sight. And that's where Jim left the pudding. And I'm afraid to tell you that the Knucker dragon ate pudding, cart, horse, and all. If Jim hadn't hidden behind a tree, then he would have gone too. And the dragon then looked up and he said, a nice starter. What's for main course? And Jim said, I'll be back later with that. You have a little snooze. And the dragon snoozed, and when Jim came back later, well, if you were the dragon, you would have seen 5 of Jim Puttock all going round in a hazy circle. The dragon was feeling very woozy indeed. In fact, the dragon was so woozy and ill that it couldn't strike Jim at all, and it was very easy for Jim then to lift his sword and cut off the head of the dragon. Different stories for different things with what happened next. Some stories say Jim Puttock was hailed as a hero, and he could have as much beer to drink as the pub would give him. Other stories say that Jim managed somehow to get some of the dragon blood on him, and that evening's celebration was his last, because that poison, well, it had for him by the morning. So that's one example of a bit of a silly monster story. I think we have time for a slightly longer story for you that is one of my favourites, I think, from the book. And it's one that I've been thinking a lot about and working a lot with lately. And this story comes from the northeast of England, from County Durham. And it concerns a lad who cared for nothing and cared for nobody. A lad that used to delight in not going to church. And every Sunday he would sit out by the river and he would curse so loudly that in the church they could hear every single cursed word he said. And his name was John Lambton. Now, the story begins one day when John Lambton was fishing and there were no fish to be had, and he was cursing louder and louder when something did bite. And popped up there in the water, he could see a little head, a little dark head with dark beady eyes. And he could already see that it wasn't a fish. And he pulled that thing into land, and there, squirming in the mud in front of him, not a great big bloated salmon this time, but a disgusting little creature, about 6 inches long, and it had 9 holes on each side of its head, and it had nasty little toothy jaws. And he poked it and it wriggled, and then there was a voice behind him. Oh dear. Oh dear, nothing good will come of that. It's an old man, long beard, standing behind him, tutting. It'll do you and yours no good to have fished that thing out of the river, but you can't put it back, he said. You're going to have to deal with it. You fished it out, you deal with it. The old man just wandered off, and John Lambton was left there thinking, well, I'm not going to be told what to do by an old man, but maybe I should listen. This is a bit weird. And he looked at the creature again, and he picked it up, and he thought, this'll do to gross somebody else out later in the day. Put it in his pocket. But later in the day, he was getting really fed up with that little creature. It stank there in his pocket, and it growled and it farted, and it was completely disagreeable. And so up towards his father's hall, Lambton Hall, John Lambton took that creature out of the pocket and straight down the well. And he waited for a little while until he heard the splash in the water at the bottom of the well, where that creature ended up. You won't be any bother to anyone there, will you? Said John Lambton. Well, the months and the years went by. Goodness knows what John Lambton got up to that was of any use at all, but down there in the well, that creature grew. Can't tell you what it fed on, but it grew and it grew and it grew. Until one day, that creature was just too big even for the well. And so it came out. It slithered out of that well, and now it was huge, and it was many, many yards long. And the creature made for home. It made for the river, but it was too big even to fit in the river, too big to fit under the surface. That creature coiled itself around a rock in the middle of the river weir, and it went to sleep. But that evening, when it woke up, it decided to go for a little adventure. And it slithered its way up through the land, and it found things that could potentially be food. Sheep, cattle, people. It was quite good fun, crunching its way through them. Not very satisfying, but better than doing nothing. And so every night, the worm would make its way up to the land, and it would terrorize it. And when it had had enough, when it had had its fill, it would coil itself 3 times around a local hill and fall fast asleep again. And so the worm got into its habits, river to hill and hill to river, and the people began to leave that place and that land. And John Lambton heard about this creature, and from a safe distance, he went to see what it was all about. And he saw those dark gleaming eyes, and he saw the 9 holes on each side of the head of the creature. And he thought, this is my fault. Can't tell anyone. Probably better if I ran away. And so he hatched a plan, because that was the time of the Crusades. And John Lambton decided that he could be a hero. He could go away to the Crusades, and maybe somebody might deal with that thing while he was away. So he did. He went off on his crusade, leaving his father up there at the windows, almost a prisoner in his own hall. And things got worse. That monster soon began to coil its tail around trees and uproot them and start to use them as clubs. The whole landscape was a wreck. And even though they tried to feed milk to the monster to placate it, it seemed to make it even angrier. And they called for heroes. Well, there were no Jim Puttocks, but there were a lot of heroes turned up to try and fight the beast. And they fought the head of the monster, the teeth, the glittering eyes. But as they fought, each and every one of them, too late, realised that the tail of the monster was coiling up and up and up around them, and then the monster just squeezed and squeezed all the life out of each one of those heroes. And then, after it had eaten them all up, it just spat out the armour like so much tin foil. What was to be done? Nothing could be done. Only the old lord in his hall seemed to make it through with the odd faithful servant that stayed with him. And 7 years later, when John Lambton came back down the track towards Lambton Hall, it was a very different landscape that he looked on. And he finally thought, I've got to own up. He told his father everything. And amazingly, his father said, well, son, can't be helped. But you must put this right. You caused it. Go to see the wise woman. And at the wise woman's house, well, she threw her herbs into the fire and she said, it won't be easy. Didn't think so, said John. Here is what you must do, she said. You must have great iron spikes welded all over your armour, all over the head and the shoulders and the back and the front and the arms and the legs. And then you must go down to the river and you must wait on the rock the creature usually coils itself around. You must wait all night until it turns up, and then you must fight it. And if you kill it, it won't be easy. You said that, said John. You must go back up to Lambton Hall. And as you cross the boundary of the land of Lambton Hall, you must kill the first thing that greets you. Otherwise, 9 generations of the Lambton family will not have the luxury of dying in their beds. Well, John Lambton left the wise woman and he went back to Lambton Hall in deep thought. He did get those spikes welded all over his armour, but he also arranged that the morning after he hopefully would kill the monster, that when they heard the sound of 3 notes from his hunting horn, the servants of Lambton Hall would release his favourite dog to come to meet him. He didn't want to kill his favourite dog, but at least he could be sure the dog would run to meet him. A little bit like controlling a prophecy. Do you think it's going to work out well? Well, the following night, John Lambton put on the armour quite carefully, walking down to the river, and there on the rock with his sword drawn he waited. And he still didn't notice the monster creeping up, coming silently through the water, until its jaws reared up and its eyes fixed on him. And did they know one another? Did the monster recognise him? Well, John Lambton couldn't wait to find out. And all the swordcraft he learned in the Crusades, all of it was put to good use fighting that creature. It was surprisingly fast. But all the time, of course, the coiled tail of that monster was curling around the rock, curling around John Lambton until he realised too late. And the creature began to close its coils, to crush him to death. But that is when the spikes drove their way into its flesh. And there was a great cry from the monster that fell back in the water. And there it was so weak that John Lambton could slice it through with his sword and slice it through again. And yet still, those bits of monster, like a worm cut in half and both parts wriggling away, wriggled back into the water and under the surface. His job wasn't done yet. Sword back in its sheath, John Lambton back up towards Lambton Hall, through the gate, and now he was taking his hunting horn and blowing 3 sharp notes. And now, coming down the hill towards him, it wasn't his dog. It was his father. No, said John Lambton. No, I can't do that. I can't kill my own father. Instead, he told his father the news, and they both slowly walked back up to the hall. And after some time to recover, the two of them set about doing the thing that they never talk about in stories: restoring the place, restoring the land back to somewhere that people would want to live and want to grow up and want to share their lives. And John Lambton thought to himself, it was just an old woman, it was just an old prophecy, it's just words. He did have that little dog put to death, nevertheless. And they say John Lambton became a fine, upstanding member of society after that. The kind of man that would do anything for anyone, anything for his community. He died quite young. It isn't recorded how. And he would have never known. But for many generations after that, not a single Lambton died peacefully in their beds. Whether they were thrown from horses, whether they died in battle, whether they were drowned, they always died a violent death. Because a prophecy is a prophecy, and a curse is a curse. So, I like to think of bits of that lantern worm still lying in wait in the water, still feeding on goodness knows what in the River Wear. But to me, that story is a really interesting one, because don't all of us have stuff in the river that we fish out and we don't want to face? It's got that kind of combination of carelessness and kind of choosing to ignore problems that I think probably we all do. So it's quite fun from that point of view. Okay, so many other river stories I could talk about that there isn't really much time to talk about today. There are stories of a lot of magic in rivers. And in case you think all of the river tales are dark and dastardly and difficult, well, a lot of them are, but not all of them are. There's a couple of swan stories in river folk tales which I've worked with, and I've found have made a really big impression on me, actually. One of them is a love story. It's about how a pair of swans help a couple to elope and to stop the young lad being killed by the girl's father, and about how those two swans almost set it up so that there has to be a meeting and the father has to give in and has to welcome the couple and recognize that there is love there. The other story isn't quite so pleasant. And the other story is from Cambridgeshire. And it's a story of a fowler on the fens who is really hungry and who decides he's going to shoot a swan. And he shoots it and he wounds it. And the other 6 swans around that part of the fen beat him with their wings and peck at him, but he gets an iron knife and he waves it at them and he fends them off. And he takes the wounded swan in a bag, struggling back to his little cottage. And the wounded swan, with its one limp wing with blood stains on the white feathers, is standing there on the stone floor of the kitchen. And he goes out to get an axe to kill it. And when he comes back, it's changed into a young woman with long fair hair and dark eyes, looking at him, just looking at him, the way a swan might. And he can't bring himself to kill her, but he can bring himself to keep her captive in the cottage. And in the old folk tales, as they say, he married her. Well, there's a euphemism. But he keeps her trapped, and she never protests. And every night, the wings of those other 6 swans are beating against the cottage and their beaks are pecking at the windows, and he never lets them in. And as her arm heals, feathers begin to sprout from her arms again towards the end of the week. And he is quite violent towards her then. But on the 7th day, they are arguing and he is just about to hit her and she transforms back into a swan. And the swan attacks him. And the swan forces him towards the door of the cottage, forces him to open the door of the cottage, and then the other 6 swans are on him as well. And they all force him towards that one little bit of the fen where all of those swans live. And it was there that his body was found face down in the mud the following day. So if there were one other little message I would give you from river folk tales, it's don't mess with swans. Do not mess with swans. Right, one more tiny little story, Pracy, for you. There are a few stories in this book which have really made me think about the future of nature. There is a very, very sad story from the east of England, from the Fens. It is in Mary Balfour's collection from the 1880s, and a few others have picked up on it as well. It's called Tiddy Munn. And Tiddy Munn is the wild, watery spirit of the fen. And Tiddy Munn is always called on by the local people when there is flood, or when there is flood threatening. He's always called on to help with water. And Tiddy Munn's voice is the plaintive call of the peewit, the lapwing, and the curlew, and all manner of other creatures, other birds that lived on the wetlands in those times. And the story tells quite simply of how the fens were drained, how people came along and they started taking on the role of Tiddy Munn. They started playing God, if you like. They started to control the water and drain it away and change the land into something different. And the whole rhythm of the place was totally upset, and the people were upset. And there was disease everywhere as a result. Well, that's about the measure of the story. It's about how they tried to keep faith in Tiddy Munn, and in some places he still hung on. But it's also about the fact that Tiddy Munn is just not there anymore. You know, the vast majority of the fens in East Anglia are wall-to-wall arable with no wildlife for miles. And the character of Tiddy Munn, for me, adds something to that story which somehow makes it more personal, and makes the grief more personal, perhaps, makes the landscape as it is today less acceptable. The other story I just wanted to touch on is a story of a river monster from Wales called the avanc. And the avanc is a creature with brown fur and very, very pointy teeth and a big flat tail. And the avanc eats people, definitely eats babies, but when hungry eats people as well. And the avanc also causes flooding. And there is a little story of how the people of a particular town tried to stop that flooding. They wanted to be able to farm the land more. They were really scared of what the monster did. And so they hatched a plot to enchant the monster using a singing maiden. What a strange vision that is. And then they put chains on the monster and they put it on the back of a big cart and they took it up to the mountains in North Wales. And they chained it to a rock next to a great lake in the rock where it couldn't cause any problems, and they left it there, and it's still there today. So if you know your Welsh, you will know that the word avanc means beaver. And I think it's a little harsh to turn the beaver into a people-eating monster in this story. But the message of flooding is a really interesting one, because if you're into anything to do with the land, you will know that there are a lot of people saying that we should allow rivers to flood more in the higher parts of river catchments so that they store flood water, so that the towns further down the catchment won't flood so easily. So there is a question there about whether these days we might choose to look on the avanc a bit more favourably, perhaps even have a conversation with it rather than just immediately think it is a monster there to be controlled. Okay, there's lots more. I would encourage you to read the book. Of course I would. It feels like it's just the start. There are so many of these stories out there that there's only so many you can fit in a book. But if any of you have got other river tales that you may want to share or to talk about, I'd love to hear of them. I'd love to hear of them. But I think I will probably stop there. And if there's any questions, please do shout.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Lisa. Do please feel free to show your appreciation to Lisa in the chat. I'm going to let Lisa just catch her breath for a moment before we turn to any comments. So I'll take this opportunity to just let you know what's coming up next time, because that will just take a minute and we'll give a bit of breathing space. So as I say, we're not hosting a talk in December. We'll let people do their Christmas thing in December. We'll be back on the last Friday in January with a very different subject. We'll be turning our attention to art history for our talk in January, which is the Penzance Pont-Aven versus the London Impressionists. And this is a talk all about two artists who really did not like each other very much at all. So the founder of the Newlyn School of Artists, Stanhope Forbes, who believed that the paintings of Walter Sickert were tawdry, vulgar, and the sentiment of the lowest music hall, versus that painter himself, Walter Sickert, who reviewed the works of Forbes very unfavourably as well. We find canvases which have nothing to recommend them to the critic, but a heavy travesty of the touch of second-rate French painters, was Sickert's opinion of Stanhope Forbes. So no love lost between these two artists. And our speaker will be comparing and contrasting their work and their lives in our next talk. And that is Dr. Billy Ruff. Billy is Associate Lecturer in Art History, gaining his PhD in Art History from the University of St Andrews and a postgraduate diploma in Museum and Gallery Studies a few years later. He's lectured in art history all over Scotland. He's given talks in various establishments, including the Tate Britain, Mansfield College in Oxford, and the National Galleries of Scotland. He really is a very, very highly respected and educated art historian, but will give a very, very accessible and entertaining talk on this subject. If you're interested at all in that, there is a link in the chat for you. If you want to pop onto our Eventbrite, you can book a place for that now. Same rules apply. You can book by giving a small donation to support the work of the library if you wish to do so, or if you need a free ticket, then you can certainly book one of those too. That booking is available now via that Eventbrite link, and if you would like to join us for that one, we would love to have you here. So that will be our next talk in January. In the chat, Martin commented earlier on, you were talking about the pollution in rivers these days. I'm going to lead somewhere with this in just a second, but Martin just had commented to say, I have, that is Martin, a live streaming microphone installed above and below the waterline of Silvergate Stream on the Blickling Hall estate here in Norfolk in the UK. Whilst installing it one day, the whole stream suddenly turned a heavy brown colour and its level rose. It ran like this for 10 minutes or so. Speaking to an estate manager, she suspected something had been released by a farmer into the stream. I was struck by the free abandon with which the pollution engulfed the whole river and then disappeared. The stream willingly carried it away. If I'd been listening to the live stream microphone, I probably would have heard some subtle change in the sound of the river. It's really interesting that there is a totally unconnected story with Blickling Hall Estate, which I talked to Martin about in the chat afterwards, concerning a water creature, actually. As in one version of the story, a large eel. In the other version of the story, a fish that disgorges a black dog, which is then the spirit of which, the ghost of which, is then either it's either laid by a local parson or bricked up in the building on the estate, again in another version of the story. So there is a water monster connection there with Blickling Hall. But where I wanted to lead to with this actually was, Lisa, you spoke about Jenny Greenteeth and the appearance of that particular water creature being connected with sewage and looking unpleasant and so on. Now, traditionally, in terms of folklore and water spirits, these stories often come about, of course, as a warning to keep people away from dangerous areas, from watercourses, from bottomless pool stories are the same thing. They're essentially to keep people away from dangerous areas. Do we find, therefore, that some of these characters are being readopted in different ways now to speak to a different concern surrounding water, for example?
That's a really interesting thought. There are still dangerous areas around. Don't get me wrong. I mean, you will probably have heard wandering around Dartmoor, as I have heard, the story being told of the hat. You know that one where someone's walking past a really bright green area on the moor and there's a hat on the ground and they pick a hat up and underneath the hat there's a head. And I said, "Are you all right?" And the guy says, "Yeah, I think I'm fine, but I'm not quite so sure about my horse." So, there are so many dangerous areas like that, but quite a lot of wetlands are no longer. They have been made safe, they have been drained, the danger has been taken away in that respect. But as we know from recent floods, rivers can kill like that. Don't go aquaplaning through floods on the roads, folks. It's not worth it. So maybe they could be reappropriated, I guess. I would love to think that there was a high enough awareness of rivers that these characters were widely known and widely appropriated. I think that's possibly one of the issues. I think as humans, we're very, very good at out of sight, out of mind, not thinking about what we flush away, not thinking about the chemicals we use, not thinking about the stuff that goes to landfill, all of that. It's much easier and nicer and more convenient to just let someone else manage all that for us. And I think, the pollution side of things is a very difficult issue with rivers, because it's like death by a thousand cuts. It's like a tiny, tiny amount of pollution that happens in a lot of places on the river equals a lot of pollution. And yet no one really takes responsibility for the little bit that is their work. And certainly in Britain, we have had the laws progressively weakened by the current government. We've had the amount of river monitoring has been drastically reduced, so we don't know with official information nearly as much of what's going on before as we did know. So things are certainly under threat. I think that it's not necessarily a new thing. I've recently been working on a story of an ash tree in St Pancras Old Churchyard in London. And I've been finding out all about the River Fleet, which is now totally underground river. It rises on Hampstead Heath in London and it comes out at Thames, and it's little more than a sewer now. And in 1860s, when the story I've been researching is set, the River Thames stank so much that they couldn't sit in the Houses of Parliament because it just stank too much. That's, much more serious than we have in the Thames now, but let's not talk about degrees, folks. We can do better than this, I don't know, Martin's just said, why do I think it's hard to tell stories about river pollution? Is it hard to characterize a large company? That's really interesting for a new story, isn't it? What character would a large company have? I think a lot of it is about what government lets the large companies get away with, to be honest with you. Because before Brexit, they weren't allowed to do what they're doing now. But I think stories about pollution are probably relatively recent. You could very easily project a pollution message onto a monster, but that may not necessarily be the original origin of the story. So it's a kind of classic example of the way that we may choose or not to adapt old stories to new situations. Or we may choose in our current tradition to use those monsters to illustrate an issue that perhaps, the River Tor, Torridge, Tean, all those rivers in Devon, they wouldn't have had these problems 150 years ago, 100 years ago. So this is modern folklore, really. That's up to us. Write a story, Martin. I'd love to hear it.
Yes, absolutely. Are the modern stories all in the news, i.e. without abstraction?
Abstraction is a much bigger problem in the East than down here in the Southwest. Are the modern stories all in the news? Not nearly enough, I would say. That's my answer.
So, yeah, so, and of course, traditionally, you know, these kinds of concerns were relayed by storytelling as much as by anything else. Of course, it was part of the role of it, wasn't it? How do you go about collecting your stories? Different storytellers work in different ways. Some storytellers collect from other storytellers. Mm-hmm. Some collect from old sources and rework. How do you tend to work?
For me, it's a total mixture. So, for example, there's one story in the book which is about Farmer Mole. It comes from Exmoor, and it's about a nasty piece of work on his little pony, drunk on cider half the time, beating his wife and children. And it's about the pixie folk deciding they want to do something about it. And so one evening in the pitch black, there are lights where Farmer Mole thought he hadn't got home from the pub yet, and he tries to get the pony to hurry up, and the pony just stays still and throws him off into the bog, into the lights, and he's never seen again. And the family are partying at the end of the story, and the pony is fed so much it gets as fat as a pig, the story says. Now, that is that was originally collected by Ruth Tongue in the written version that I've found. But I've also heard Exmoor farmers say, oh yeah, there's Mole Corner up there. It's a story that's well known in various versions. And so I guess I've found the story, I've talked about it with local people, I've worked my own version of it. It's a mixture of things. Generally, if I find a written story, I will want to try and trace it back to its earliest source. And I'll want to try and find a number of sources for it if I can. And I will work from that. If it's a story that I've only heard storytellers tell, I will ask their permission. I will ask where they got it. I will try and trace it back as far as I can that way. It's like that, I think it was Ben Haggerty who once said, all storytelling is theft, but there is honor among thieves. I think it's really important to acknowledge the people who bore this story and who passed it on, and try to represent and honor as much of that network as you possibly can as a storyteller. I think that's really important.
Nothing else from anybody in the chat at the moment. If you do want to ask a last minute question, do pop it in. In the meantime, where can people go to find out more about what you are doing?
Aha, there's a website link here, isn't there, Mark? I'm not very good at this stuff.
Well, I hope you know the address of your website.
I can type that in now. So yes, I do have a website. So I tend to put up there the different gigs and different things that are going on, which is a reminder I've got to post some stuff up there for Solstice. Thank you. I'm doing an online storytelling for the Solstice and a few different gigs around Devon as well. So I'll just type this in now. And then do have a look. There is a mailing list link at the bottom of every page on my website. So you can actually sign up, and I usually send out something maybe once a month of what's going on. So yeah, do come along. You're very welcome.
So there we go. For those that are watching back after the event, Lisa's website is at www.lisaschneidau.co.uk. Very easy to find. And you can also get any of Lisa's books from all good book-selling establishments, whether online or actually in real life. Martin, what are the key aspects of oral storytelling traditions that you think have the potential to bring about pro-environmental attitudes or behaviour?
Wow, that's a really big question, Martin. I like it. So I think most stories are about connection. And I think that one of the solutions to our current environmental crisis is connection. So I think an awful lot more stories than we give credit for can help with environmental work. But I think those stories that do actually talk about the non-human, and by that I mean animals, plants, trees, monsters, fairies, everything, are very, very important because they take us out of ourselves. I think an awful lot of human culture is so self-obsessed these days that anything that encourages connection to local environment is really important. I do think there is an awful lot that storytellers all over the world can do to what you might call rewild their storytelling. This is a real thing of mine that I'm working very hard to do. And I think just really working the non-human in stories as much as the human. So working on what those environments would be like, what you want them to be like, noticing those things. And when I say working on, obviously all of us as storytellers, we will rip a story apart, put it back together again, work on all the different characters and get to know it as much as possible. So I would say if you're a storyteller, try looking at all of the non-human characters, even if they're trees, rocks, doesn't matter what's going on there. That will result in a more environmental story. Environment needs to not be considered as separate from us, I believe. So it's integrating it into everything rather than choosing stories which are solely about environment and not humans, of which I think there are quite few. A lot of the kind of environmental stories that I've found in my travels have been a bit preachy, a bit worthy. I like the stories where it's all part of the same thing. Yeah, if that helps.
Excellent. I'm sure it does. Thank you very much. Joe just wraps up there by saying that all of your books are on Joe's Christmas list. So there we go.
Thank you, Joe. That's great.
So yes, everybody do put Lisa's books on your Christmas list. You've got plenty of time for people to go and get them. In the meantime, it just remains for me to say thank you very much, Lisa, for taking the time to come and support the library with this talk today. And thank you to everybody for coming along. Do please show your appreciation in the Zoom method of your choice, which essentially is in the chat because I've got everything else locked, to Lisa for that presentation. Thank you, Lisa.
That's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for asking me along.